Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me. I should warn you, I mean, this is a bit like, well, it's the sort of thing if any of you go to study history at university, it's the sort of thing you'll probably get as an undergraduate lecture, and your teacher, whose name I can't remember, I'm afraid, who I seem to have taught, will have experienced this sort of thing when he was at Birmingham. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes with some slides. And at the end, I'll be happy to take any questions you've got, anything that you're puzzling over as you study the English Civil War. I'll be very happy to try and respond to your queries. Right. So, I mean, the first thing to say about Charles is, I mean, he's undoubtedly one of the most contradictory and enigmatic monarchs in English history, and remains one of the hardest for historians to try to pin down and really get a grip of. They've either tended to go overboard in enthusiasm for him, or admiration for him, and you know, with his very brave sort of martyrdom in 1649, or they've loathed him, and they've certainly found it quite difficult to provide the sort of dispassionate and balanced judgments that academic historians are supposed to provide when they're studying particular individuals. And the debate about Charles, I think, shows no sign of dying down. Some of you may have read Mark Kishlansky's Little Penguin biography of Charles, which was published in 2014, which is tremendously readable. Fascinating, some fascinating insights, very controversial, because basically he sets out to absolve Charles from any blame for most of the political conflicts of his reign and for the outbreak of the Civil War. I have to say my view of Charles is pretty much diametrically opposed to that. So this is very much the case for the sort of prosecution, trying to sort of bring out what I see as some of the flaws in Charles's political makeup, which made a civil war possible in 1642. So I think any attempt to understand Charles, let me just, which button do I press to?
It's one of the arrow buttons there.
Oh yeah, there's Charles and all the sort of part of the sort of debate that he's conjured up. So I think any attempt to understand Charles has to begin with his very difficult childhood. Unfortunately, we don't know much about this, but it is at least clear that he grew up very much in the shadow of his elder brother and sister, Henry and Elizabeth, and was more or less ignored, or at least starved of affection, by his own parents. And it wasn't until he became heir to the throne with Henry's premature death in 1612 that people actually began to take notice of him. And what they discovered was a rather shy, extremely gauche adolescent with a very pronounced stammer, which Charles never got rid of. It said he managed to stop stammering at his trial just before his execution, but that's one of the sort of later legends, I think. And also, along with this, a tendency to fits of rage and jealousy, directed particularly towards the glamorous young men who very much dominated his father's affections. And there's an incident in 1616 when, in front of the royal court, he turns a water fountain full on the face of George Villiers, of course, James's new toy boy, effectively, soaks Villiers to the skin, enormously embarrasses him, which is, I think, indicative of Charles's own early frustration, typical attention-seeking device. Charles by this time was 16, in a 16-year-old. Perhaps not the sort of thing any of you would do, but this is the sort of thing that they did at royal courts in the early Stuart period. So Charles, as a young man, was not the stuff of which 17th century rulers were supposed to be made. But by the 1630s, he transformed himself into a dignified, kingly figure who was every bit as impressive as his continental counterparts Louis XIII of France and Philip IV of Spain. So how did this come about? How did Charles transform himself? Well, in part, it was through a very considerable effort of willpower. Charles was acutely conscious of the responsibilities of his office, and although he lacked self-confidence, he made himself play to the full what he regarded as the proper role of a king. So in spite of his stammer, he made himself go through the ordeal of public speaking when he felt it was appropriate, and regularly delivered speeches on public occasions like the opening of Parliament, and actually earned a good deal of admiration for doing so, partly because he was always much briefer and more to the point than his father had been. More significantly, he also exercised very close direction over the processes of government. Now, the extent of to which Charles was ruling, to which Charles was in charge, has been much debated by historians and very often underestimated by those who tended to be taken in by contemporary claims that Charles was dominated by a succession of royal favourites, from Buckingham through Lord Wentworth to his own wife, Henrietta Maria. Very important to remember, I think, that in the 17th century it was common practice always to blame councillors rather than the monarch for unpopular decisions. And in fact, a close examination of the processes of government at almost any stage in the reign reveals that it was Charles himself who was very much in charge, attending to the day-to-day business of government and dominating the decision-making process. Kevin Sharp has written a monumental book on the, very good book on the Charles I's personal rule, describes him as a princely swot. And I think this captures very nicely his very earnest and determined approach to the business of government. And if one looks at the state papers of the period, his marginal annotations show that he read them very carefully and thoughtfully and issued clear instructions. And his secretaries testified to the promptness with which he read petitions and letters and made decisions. So here's a couple of letters from his secretary, Windybank, reporting to him. He was away from London, the council at the time, reporting to him on the council discussions. And you can probably see, I mean, Charles has very nice, clear handwriting. He writes in the margins all his decisions on the various matters that the council was raising with him. So, ye did well, he says here. So I do, it's something he agrees with. If not now, when? But I see ye all so frightened ye can resolve on nothing. This was written in 1640 when the Privy Council in London were panicking over the Scottish invasion and were not able to sort of get their act together at all. Charles at the time was up in York, I think, still, and he was determined to get them to organise themselves and organise effective resistance and funding to continue the war. So, it always comes out with very trenchant comments. I like not this, he says, about some corrupt official in Ireland. So you can see, just from at a glance from these state papers, how much Charles is involved. I don't know how much, you probably haven't done much European history, but I mean, in many ways he's comparable to Philip II of Spain, who was famous for his dedication to the work of government and was said to have, read and processed up to 400 letters a day. Well, I don't think Charles is quite at that level, but he's clearly reading stuff very carefully and processing it very carefully. And at the same time, he's keeping close control of the political processes at the heart of government. In particular, the key business of making appointments. I mean, he, like, our recent Prime Minister, Liz Truss, and our present Prime Minister is entirely responsible for the make-up of the Privy Council, which is the equivalent to the modern cabinet. And as you can see from recent experience, the monarch's decisions, or the Prime Minister's decisions in this respect, have a crucial impact on policy making and the direction of policy. And Charles, certainly after the death of Buckingham in 1628, seems to have been the one who's calling the shots when it comes to to key appointments, and also dominating when he's sitting in the Privy Council, very much dominating the discussion and the decision-making process. He's also coming to look the part of a king. Basically, thanks to Anthony van Dyck, who's probably must be, I think, the most brilliant royal image maker that there's ever been. The transformation in Charles's sort of appearance and the image that he presents to the world is quite remarkable if one compares Van Dyck's paintings. Sorry about this slide, there's something down to it. Compares Van Dyck's representation to the other portrait painters of the day. So this partially obliterated slide is dealing with a similar theme to this slide here. It basically shows the royal family surrounded by the accessories of kingship with their little children with them. So we've got, on the left, we've got a painting by Henry Potts, done soon after the birth of Prince Charles in 1632. On the right, we've got Van Dyck's treatment done a year later. And there are various stylistic devices which make Van Dyck's rendering far more striking and impressive. I mean, you can see here, he looks at, you know, I think this is Potts' representation of Charles. He looks, you know, he's standing there looking, sort of, trying to look sort of commanding. But the expression on his face gives it away a bit. I mean, he just doesn't look as if he's in control. He looks a bit out of his depth. Van Dyck has completely changed the sort of aura around the king. He doesn't have to stand up to dominate the scene. He's sitting down, but in a posture of sort of relaxed command, basically. And to emphasise that he's the centre of everything, you've got the Queen looking slightly towards him, you've got this great big pillar sort of pointing towards him. And a wonderful touch. I mean, Van Dyck's brilliant at doing children. You've got, you know, the little prince with his hand on his dad's knee, which, you know, suggests intimacy at the same time as command and an aura of kingship. This is this one's come out, I'm pleased to say. So two portraits done very close together, of exactly the same theme, but I think, well, I hope you can see what I think are the superior aspects of Van Dyck's technique and ability to project the royal image. I mean, on this side you've got, I mean, the two figures look a bit wooden and lifeless and lumpy. I mean, here you've got, well, Henrietta Maria is transformed into an image of a sort of beautiful princess with lovely curls around her face. Charles is sort of relaxed, commanding, but, you know, with his sort of fingers stretched out in a sort of elegant gesture. I mean, look at that. If you compare the hand there and the hand there, I mean, there's not really much comparison. And what you get, again and again in Van Dyck's paintings, is these images of elegance and majesty and control and command, which was just how Charles wanted to see himself. But it embodies all the sort of great, you know, the idealised features of a Renaissance monarch. Quite a few portraits of Charles on horseback. Several reasons for this. One was that Charles was extremely short. He was about 5'1". So posing on a horse made up for that. But also the whole idea of a monarch on horseback commanding and controlling a sort of powerful beast from nature is another aspect of kingly authority that Charles is very keen on. He's also, actually, one of his great talents was as a horseman. He was a very talented horseman and very keen on jousting, very good at jousting. Not very good as a commander-in-chief, unfortunately, but it, certainly on the tilt, in the tilt yard, Charles cut in a very impressive figure, and again matched up to everybody's image of what an ideal monarch should be. And to that, Van Dyck manages to suggest a sort of philosophical depth and understanding, a sort of gravitas in Charles's persona, which I think comes out best in this very famous triple portrait, which was done so that the Italian sculptor Bernini could design a bust of Charles. So he tries to depict him from three angles, but in the process gives his face this wonderful sort of rather melancholy expression, which for contemporary would, I think, have suggested a sort of philosophical depth, gravitas, control, command, wisdom, all the sorts of things that a monarch in this period was supposed to be endowed with. And unfortunately, in some respects, which Charles spectacularly lacked, but you wouldn't know it from Van Dyck's portraits, which I think are a brilliant representation of Charles, how he liked to see himself. In spite of appearances, however, Charles, I think, still lacked many of the personal qualities that were needed in an age when so much depended on a monarch's personal relationships with his leading subjects and politicians. Whatever their other failings, his predecessors Elizabeth and James had been really shrewd and capable when it came to the art of man management. Charles was not. Perhaps because of his early upbringing, he was never a particularly confident judge of human character and found it very difficult to take a detached view of his relationships with his counsellors. So as a result, he tended either to go overboard in his affection and loyalty towards them, most spectacularly, of course, in the case of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, who he seems to regard as a sort of elder brother and defended to the hilt in spite of attacks on him by Parliament, refused to get rid of him when Parliament, it would have been much easier for him to do so, and a more calculating monarch would almost certainly have sacrificed Buckingham. But Charles is very loyal to counsellors he trusts and believes in, and that makes for something which has often not often been seen as one of Charles's achievements, which is a very settled pattern of court politics in the 1630s at any rate. You get away from the faction battles which divided the court under his father and the constant sort of shifting from one favourite to the next to a pretty settled pattern of government. The problem is, as I'll explain in a minute, I think the people he chooses to trust as counsellors are profoundly out of sympathy with the mainstream opinion in the political nation, with the sort of moderate Calvinist, pro-Protestant foreign policy that most of the political nation and most of Parliament favoured, which was very much not what Charles or councillors like Weston or Laud wanted. Another feature of Charles's personality, which I think hampers him politically to a very considerable extent, and which again I think can be traced back to his childhood, is a profound lack of confidence in the loyalty of his people, which shows itself on the progresses he makes around the countryside. You know, like Queen Elizabeth and James, he goes on regular summer tours of the nation. But whereas they were very good at meeting ordinary people and putting them at their ease and glad-handing them and so on, Charles always found that very difficult and tended to sort of shy away from extended contact with ordinary people. Now, that in itself wasn't necessarily a particular problem, but it does seem to have been symptomatic of an attitude which was to be very damaging for Charles politically, because the anxiety that he seems to have had about the loyalty of his people led him into continually devising ways of testing that loyalty. So right from the start of his reign, Charles insists that grants of taxation are basically tests of loyalty. He tells Parliament and his people that if they don't pay up to the various taxes that he wants, like the forced loan or like ship money, this would show that they didn't trust him and couldn't be relied on to obey him. Now, of course, most of his subjects didn't want to see these things in these terms at all. I mean, basically, they just didn't like paying taxes. But Charles's repeated insistence that the whole basis of trust was at stake each time he asked for a controversial tax, forced them to confront the fact that they didn't see things the same way as their king. I mean, it brought about largely unnecessary conflicts and disagreements. And Charles's lack of confidence in the loyalty of his subjects was also an element in his unwillingness to try to achieve his ends by bargaining and negotiation. His normal approach when he encountered a political problem was to try to bludgeon his way through by the use of royal authority. And again, this betrayed his sense of insecurity. The problem was that for a monarch to rely too often and too directly on personal authority could be politically disastrous. Rulers like Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth appreciated it was always much better, if you were the monarch, to appear to be acting through the agency of others, so that if things went wrong, they would take the blame, and you could get rid of them, as Henry VIII did famously with Cardinal Wolsey, and Elizabeth, well, doesn't get rid of most of her counsellors, but she certainly makes clear her disapproval of some of the things that they were doing. Charles never seems to have understood the importance of allowing counsellors basically to carry the blame for unpopular policies, and refused to play the traditional game of sacrificing them when political expediency suggested he ought to do so. And in many ways, I mean, hardly anything could be more calculated to upset the balance of faith and trust in the monarch on which political stability rested. So, Charles's traits of personality, I think, did a good deal to undermine political trust in his reign. And they certainly made it much more difficult for opponents to negotiate a settlement with him when various political crises arose, as they did fairly regularly. But of course, these crises need not have arisen in the first place had it not been for conflicts over policy and ideology, which divided Charles from many of his subjects. Now, just how profound these divisions over policy and ideology were has been the subject of considerable debate amongst early Stuart historians. And it can get quite complicated. But basically, I would say that this is the main issue on which I would part company with so-called revisionist historians like Conrad Russell and Kevin Sharp. I hope it's not oversimplifying their views to say that the revisionists argue that in ideological terms, the gap between Charles and most of his people was relatively narrow. They had, both lots had shared beliefs over things like the benefits of the rule of law and the importance of regular meetings of Parliament. What caused conflict, as Kevin Sharp puts it, was that Charles suffered from energy. Whereas his father had been content to let sleeping dogs lie, and above all avoid European wars, Charles jumped in with both feet at the start of his reign, getting England involved in disastrous wars with France and Spain, and then insisting on trying to reform everything when he was ruling without parliamentary and personal rule. This, combined with structural problems like the chronic state of the royal finances, got people's backs up and led to the political clashes that took place both inside and outside Parliament. That's basically a rather simplified version of the sort of revisionist interpretation of what goes wrong in Charles's reign. My view, I have to say, is that ideological differences were much more profound and are much closer to, if you like, traditional Whig historians who stress that Charles had very different views from most of his people over issues like the scope of the royal prerogative and the role of Parliament. But one of the problems with this, and one of the reasons why this topic has been so hotly debated, is that it's quite difficult to resolve these issues because evidence of Charles's political views is often limited and ambiguous. Unlike his father James, he didn't write long political treatises or expound his views at length in public. So to understand what's going on in Charles's political psyche, if you like, we have to rely instead on more oblique indicators. Reports of what he said in private, often very valuable. The texts of proclamations and declarations which were written by others but issued in his name and clearly approved and often corrected by him. And the source that I want to look at in a bit of detail now, which is the court masques and entertainments of the 1630s. Now these masques are a very curious phenomenon. They're a bit like pantomimes. There's nothing quite like, well, I suppose pantomime would be the nearest thing to them in modern drama, but with a much more serious purpose. And because of this, efforts to restage them have come unstuck because modern audiences don't really understand the conventions of the masque. Yet they were vehicles for the talents of many of the outstanding dramatists of the period, people like Ben Jonson, William Davenant, James Shirley. Shakespeare's probably the only leading dramatist of this period who doesn't write court masques. Charles himself is very closely involved with these masques. He collaborates very closely with the main producer, this man Inigo Jones, the royal architect, and he lavishes huge amounts of time and money on each performance, which usually takes place around Christmas time. They usually perform the Mass on 12th night. And most significantly, Charles and Henrietta Maria both take leading parts in the performance of the Mask, which makes them particularly significant as statements of how the king saw himself and wanted to project himself. Now, masks were different from stage plays. The sort of stage plays, the sort of Shakespeare plays that we're probably much more familiar with relating to this period. In several important respects. The first one is that whereas the plays of the period were primarily intended to be listened to, in the Masque, a much greater emphasis was placed on what one saw, on visual effects. And you can see the difference in the theatres that both types of performance use. This is a drawing of a popular London theatre, probably the Globe, in the early 1600s. And as you can see, the lack of space for moving around on stage and the very primitive nature of the scenery and the backdrops mean that inevitably the popular theatre in London is much more an experience in listening to the spoken word, which is why Shakespeare's so amazingly brilliant. I mean, the lines he comes up with, rather than an experience, more visual experience. The masking theatre is quite different. This is, masks took place in what was known as a perspective theatre. And this is a drawing from 1635 of one of the theatres that Jones designed specifically for the performance of this masque, Florimond. So this is the stage area, if you like, and this gives you a sense of what it would look like from the front. You've got all these bits of scenery and scenery is pretty undeveloped in the theatre at this stage, but Jones is absolutely brilliant at designing very impressive backdrops and scenery, and I'll show you some of them in a minute. But these flats had to be sort of wheeled on stage using this big mechanical wheel. So this is the stage area. But what's interesting about the perspective theatre is that the best perspective on the stage is given to whoever's sitting halfway to the back, dead centre, which is where the royal box is. Okay, so the first part of the Mass, the King and Queen sit in the royal box to watch the play, but also to be seen by the rest of the audience. And then the audience is arranged hierarchically, so that depending on how senior you are at the court, determines what sort of view you get of what's happening on stage. So this is the box for the Earl of Arundel, who's the Earl Marshal, the most senior nobleman at court. Pretty good view, just behind the King and Queen. This is the box for Sir Thomas Edmunds, who's important politician, but a fairly lowly figure in the court hierarchy, as you can see here. A great view of what's going on, although he's quite near to the action. Well, the perspective theatre, above all, offers all sorts of possibilities for special effects, because it allows for a series of flats and backdrops to be cranked onto the stage at appropriate moments, using this huge wheel. And Jones, in particular, was renowned for the lavish and spectacular nature of his special effects, most famously demonstrated in the climax to a masque of 1640, the Salmo Siva Spolia, when a huge mechanical cloud, this is his drawing of it, the design, was wound down onto the stage, carrying the Queen and her attendants. One imagines, health and safety would go out of fit over this sort of thing if it was attempted today. But this feat of visual pyrotechnics was said to have staggered onlookers and created precisely the sense of awe and wonder at the majesty of kingship that Jones was striving for. Now, the basic theme of all these masques was to proclaim the authority of the king and celebrate his achievements through a representation of his role in the ongoing struggle between virtue and vice. Performances began with what was known as the anti-masque, in which a world of order and harmony was plunged into chaos by vices and evil influences. And the forms taken by these vices are very instructive because they illustrate the court's perception of its enemies, particularly during the personal rule. Often these vices were fairly abstract, representing greed, lust, selfishness, and so on. But occasionally they were much more obvious and immediate political relevance. So in the masque in 1634 called the Temple of Love, the main anti-masque character is a man with a big black stovepipe hat, dressed all in black, denouncing stage plays. Well, this must have been instantly recognisable to the audience as a depiction of William Prynne, who'd recently been had up in Star Chamber for attacking stage plays, and in particular attacking the Queen's participation in stage plays. The anti-masque was followed by a middle section, in which the evils of the anti-masque were banished by the appearance of all sorts of virtues. Now, this is the point at which the King and Queen actually appear on stage. Charles, they might look at entirely in this costume. Charles was usually the epitome of masculine virtues such as strength, justice, fortitude. The Queen was a manifestation of pure, uncorrupted, platonic love and beauty, and these are some of the couple of the costumes that they wore. This is often the longest section of the masque, as a chorus discoursed on the two monarchs' capacities for bringing harmony and understanding, whilst they, in their attendance, danced in front of Jones's backdrops of classical architecture and ordered landscapes. And finally, the performance would come to a climax when the maskers on stage descended into the auditorium to join with those who were present in a dance which was intended to emphasise that what was happening on stage was closely connected with reality, was an extension of reality, a depiction, if you like, of the idealised forms of real things in which all those present were participating. And in keeping with this, the theme of some of these masks was sometimes of very direct contemporary relevance. And I think one of the best examples is this Masque Britannia Triumphans, performed in 1638. So here again, Jones's drawings for the stage sets, which show the River Thames with the recently refurbished St Paul's Cathedral in the background, and it's intended as an image of England enjoying peace and prosperity after 9 years of the personal rule. This is followed by the appearance of the anti-masque characters, who were an odd collection of contemporary and historical bogeymen. So you've got fat lawyers who you know prospered on the ripping off their clients. You've got courtiers who committed the ultimate sin of being out of fashion. And interestingly, you've got the leaders of popular rebellions against the monarchy, the sort of bogeymen of English history as far as the monarchy was concerned. John Cade, David Rhodes in 1540, Jack Straw, who was one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, and Robert Kett from Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk. And before long, these characters have reduced London to what Jones's notes describe as a horrid hell, a mass of sort of burned out buildings. But the situation is very quickly rescued by Charles appearing on stage in the guise of Britannicles, an ancient British king embodying traditional British virtues who, with the help of a large fleet of ships, restores order and tranquility. This is the closing scene, a peaceful haven with Charles's fleet having brought order and harmony. Now, there's nothing particularly unusual about this masque, and the theme of chaos giving way to order on the arrival of virtue is common to all of them. What makes it particularly interesting is its timing, because it was put on in a great hurry in February 1638 to coincide with the delivery of some of the judgments in Hamden's ship money case. And the production contains some very obvious contemporary allusions with references to the role of the English Navy in clearing the seas of pirates, which is Charles's basic justification for collecting ship money. And the depiction of this ultra-modern battleship, which was taken to represent the sovereign of the seas, the new flagship launched in 1637 with the proceeds from ship money. So on one level, the Britannia Triumphans masque is an exercise, a very direct exercise in propaganda, designed to remind the courtly audience of the reasons for ship money and the policies behind it. But it's much more than this, because it's also a symbolic enactment by Charles of the role that he hoped to perform in bringing peace and order to England and the seas around it. I'm going to skip the next slide, which is another depiction of the sea spolier, and just move on to drawing some conclusions. So the reason why I've embarked on this fairly lengthy digression into court masks is because I think they provide a very informative insight into Charles's ideological makeup and political style. In the first place, I think they offer some important clues about Charles's thinking in matters of high politics. It's of very considerable significance, I think, that in none of the masks performed at court is there any suggestion that those outside the court, in other words, the ordinary people of England, have any positive contribution to make in establishing order and harmony. Parliament never appears in the masque, never mentioned in the masque. And when the people are on stage, they're either cast as disobedient and rebellious characters of the anti-masque, like those rebels that I showed you, or loving but essentially passive subjects who look on whilst the king performs all sorts of heroic and creative acts. Now, this situation, it seems to me, is not far removed from the clues we get elsewhere about the king's attitude to parliaments. It wasn't that Charles disliked parliaments in principle, but rather that when Parliament met, he expected it to behave in a docile and submissive manner, particularly when it came to making grants of taxation. If they didn't behave like this, then Charles tended to suspect Parliament of all sorts of disloyal and subversive intentions, and to believe that they were dominated by popular demagogues bent on destroying monarchy. And I think it's this view, this attitude, more than anything else, which explains his determination to rule without Parliament after 1629, since by effectively abolishing Parliament for the time being, he feels he's denying the Crown's opponents any opportunities to organise activity which might be damaging to the Crown. However, this didn't mean that Charles thought he should rule alone, because even in the masques, where he's invariably presented as the principal virtue, the primary virtue, he's always accompanied by subordinate virtues who carry out his bidding and seek to imitate his perfection. And it's significant, I think, that these roles were performed by members of the nobility who were present at court. So, if you like, one could suggest that Charles has a vision of the political order which matches the seating plan of that perspective theatre that I showed you earlier. The king and queen at the centre of everything, his peers, privy councillors, leading noblemen arranged in descending order of seniority around him, and the rest of the political nation shut out. Secondly, I think masks also provide clues as to how Charles thought royal power actually operated. Because steeped as he was in the ideology and images of divine right kingship, and this is what Van Dyck's portraits are all about, these images of divine right kingship, he seems to have believed that order in the world of politics was imposed rather in the way it was in the masque, by the king acting out his role as an example to his people and laying down guides and patterns for them to follow. And I think this is most apparent in the way in which he sets about realising one of his most obsessive concerns during the 1630s, which is establishing order and hierarchy throughout the political nation. This is a process which Charles sees as beginning at the top with his own royal court, where he introduces a whole series of new regulations on a level of ritual which would not have been out of place at the famous court at Versailles, presided over by Louis XIV later in the 17th century. So, according to these regulations, everything that the king does, literally from putting on his royal socks in the morning with the aid of a gentleman usher, to being tucked up in bed at night by an esquire of the body, was attended with an appropriate ceremony. So everything is sort of ritualised and ceremonialised. So after Charles has washed in the morning, the royal towel is sort of paraded round the court at the head of a procession. Everybody's expected to sort of bow to the royal towel as it goes past, because this has come into direct contact with the king's sacred person. It's what he's used to wash himself with, basically. Now, all this is designed first and foremost to celebrate the king's semi-divine status, the fact that he is a demigod, halfway to being a god as a really 17th century monarch. But it's also intended to turn the court into a model, a pattern of an ideal society which people could emulate in their daily lives by some sort of process of osmosis. So he thinks that by doing all these things at court, somehow this is going to translate itself into action in the nation as a whole. So again and again, what we see in a lot of Charles's policies, particularly during the personal rule, is the approach embodied in the masque of presenting idealised images and symbolic acts as a pattern and an example which it was believed could shape responses in the world of political events. And this brings us to the third aspect of the masque that I want to mention, which is the impression they give of a king who was in danger of losing touch with political reality. Now, one shouldn't push this too far. Charles wasn't a fool and he wasn't living in a fantasy world, however it may sometimes have appeared. But there is no doubt that Charles had a very limited understanding of the hopes and fears of most of his people, and perhaps even less in the way of sympathy for them. And one of the clearest demonstrations of this was his discussions with the papal envoys, Gregory Panzani and George Con, in the mid-1630s, about the possibility of reuniting the Church of England with the Church of Rome. Now, how seriously he actually pursued this is a matter of some debate, and in the end, the discussions don't come to anything. But I think that the very fact that Charles could consider this at all, he could even contemplate a course of action which would have horrified most of his people more than almost anything else he could possibly have done. Because remember, England is a profoundly anti-Catholic, anti-Popish country at this time. Insofar as there's a sort of sense of English national identity, it's generally expressed basically in terms of hatred of the Pope and Spain and all those forces which had conspired to launch the Spanish Armada in 1588 and attempt to bring about the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. So the fact that Charles can even suggest this idea of a reunification with Rome demonstrates a monarch who is profoundly out of touch. And this, I think, emerges most disastrously in the late 1630s in his policy towards the Scots. And this is crucial because it's the Prayer Book Rebellion and the failure of Charles's Scottish policy from 1637 onwards that effectively creates a situation out of which we get a civil war. His refusal to his refusal to engage in meaningful negotiation with the Scots in the summer of 1638, when there were all sorts of opportunities to settle things, led to the Covenanters seizing the initiative and attracting much more widespread support than might otherwise have been the case. And it was his refusal to disown the prayer book, which was based on the view that once his personal views were made clear, he would be instantly obeyed, which forces a lot of the Scots into signing the National Covenant in the first place, because it's confronting them with the fact that they are opposing the king rather than his ministers. Charles owns the prayer book, takes complete responsibility for the issuing of the Scottish prayer book in a famous proclamation, and by doing this effectively forces the majority of the Scots into signing the National Covenant and committing what Charles sees as an act of rebellion which brings about the Scottish War. So it's the failure of Charles's Scottish policy which necessitates the summoning of the Short Parliament, brings to an end the personal rule, sets in train the events which lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. And it's this failure which I think provides a classic example of a political test that Charles fails, and does so because of a blinkered view of politics which makes it very hard for him to understand anyone's ideological viewpoint other than his own. And also, coupled with this, a lack of judgment about when to apply pressure and when to make concession, which is a theme that goes right through Charles's reign. Unlike his father, who talked the talk of a sort of divine right monarch, but when it came to acting, was very shrewd and calculating about just how far he could push things. Unlike his father, who rarely made the mistake of confusing divine right ideals with political reality, Charles seems to have felt that he was entitled to impose on his subject his own vision of what was politically right and proper. And because of this, in the final analysis, I find it very hard to disagree with the verdict given by Conrad Russell that without Charles on the throne, the outbreak of the English Civil War is almost impossible to imagine. Thanks very much. Thank you.